Hey everyone, Casella here. End of the year. Thanks for listening along. Just a quick reminder that you can support the podcast and the ARB on Patreon and by purchasing books through our bookshop links. Leaving a rating or a quick comment wherever you listen also helps a ton. We've got some very cool stuff coming up in 2026, but for now, let's get into this episode. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello, and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Casella. Usually, we look at one book, some kind of speculative fiction, but today, in our hubris, we are attempting to say something coherent about this entire year, and I am delighted to have Dan Hartland thumbing his nose at the gods right here beside me. Listeners may already know Dan, but in case you don't, he is one of the reviews editors at Strange Horizons, where you can also read some of his work. His writing has also been published in Foundation, Vector, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and he writes the very cool Snap Criticism series for the ARB. Dan, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Casella. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm a little flustered in the way that is very standard for this time of year. Have a lot going on, have not done all of my Christmas prep or baking, and have all kinds of things going on. But
And when you say you haven't done all of it, have you done any of it?
I have cogitated. You know,
Okay.
I've put in
that's a big
the real work. I've thought about what I need to
That's
do.
right.
So that's half the battle,
It's
right?
practically over. Yeah.
Really,
Yeah.
I could basically just be done now and get course credit, you know?
We're in the same space. It's good.
How are you? How are you doing?
Yeah, good, I think. So in case this interrupts listeners' in pleasure and enjoyment of this episode, I do have a cough and a cold right now. But other than that, I'm pretty good. And I'm just put in the holiday business into one corner of my brain where I work over that. And I'm sure everything will be fine.
But let's talk about this year. Let's talk about this year in books. So I wanted to do this. I want to try to do like a roundup episode every year where we kind of look back at what's been going on. But as I said in the intro, as we were talking earlier, the idea of trying to say something cohesive about the whole project is just kind of silly. I do still want to try to do it. I want to be clear, but I want to make this a little more just kind of how it's been for us, just some trends and themes we've been noticing. So I guess I wanted to start out just asking you, what has your 2025 been like in genre? You know, you've been editing reviews, you've been writing, you've been doing Critical Friends, the podcast for Strange Horizons, you've been looking at awards and commenting on things. Yeah, what's your year been like? What's jumped out at you?
It's been good. I think and I entirely agree that, these kind of year roundup things are exercises in hubris and will always be overtaken by events. I think any theme that is worth that noun is a multi-year thing. Mm-hmm. So if we can see anything that's happening in 2025, either it won't happen in 2026, in which case it stops being a theme, or it's already started in 2024 or earlier, in which case it's not really to do with 2025. So I think it's always just a snapshot thing, where we might be, like before the waveform collapses. But that said, I think when you ask how my year's been, I think that my year has partly been dictated by what I would say is one of the themes of the year, which is an absence of kind of big books, like an absence of tent poles or firesides or whatever else that we all gather around. So for those who don't know, Strange Horizons publishes 3 reviews a week. Those reviews are always at least 1,000 words. They are often much more than that. So that's a lot of words to get through in a single year. And it's even more words, or at least more work to get through, when the genre is as sort of proliferating as it is and has been. It's not as if we quite know where always to look. And I'm sure we've missed books we should have covered. But it's because it feels like there's a lot going on, which is great. And I think, yeah, there's been, I wouldn't say running to catch up, but it's always been very clear at the Strange Horizons Reviews department, at least, that there's a lot potentially to try and cover in one way or another. And you're not going to be able to cover every book, but maybe you can try and cover every little corner of the genre if you possibly can, and even that is probably a bit ambitious. So I think that's how and that's true in Snap criticism as well. It's true in how I've been looking at the awards, which have been really interestingly diverse this year in terms of what they're looking at and particularly which titles they're rewarding. So I think that's how I'd talk about my year, really. I wouldn't want to use the word biddy, like it's not, but there's been a lot going on to try and think about.
Any highlights for you out of the areas in the genre you've been most active this year? Anything that like jumped out at you as like an interesting, cool thing?
Yeah, I think that the sort of continuing interest or apparent sort of vibrancy of fantasy is a real thing for us to sort of think about and get our teeth into, and I like to see it. It does seem to be coming at the expense of quote unquote sort of traditional science fiction, which is sad to see. You know, I often think about the kinds of books that we were seeing 20 years ago, which we just don't seem to be seeing right now. But I think that said, you know, if you look at the fact that both Gautam Bhatia's The Sentence and Vajra Chandrasekhara's Rakesfall have got big awards, something right is happening there. Because I think in The Sentence, and The Sentence is a weird book because I think it was published in December 2024, but it's getting its kind of big Anglophone world, you know, US, UK release next year. So it's kind of, you know, is it a 2025 book? I don't know. But it really struck me when I reviewed it early in 2025 for Foundation, because it was this kind of fast-moving, light book, which also had a lot of ideas, but was really quite embedded in a pretty old-fashioned way of writing science fiction. And then, of course, Rakesfall, which, you know, is, well, what is Rakesfall?
I feel like I need like a little like jingle, like this is now the corner of the podcast episode where we talk about how we can't summarize Rakesfall, which we do. We do every episode. Yeah.
So I think somewhere things might be kind of leveling out in one way, despite all this proliferation. Every award has chosen a different book to look at, which is great to see. That is exciting. I think it's better than just being dominated by one or two names, and I think that would be my highlight, the kind of polyvocal nature of the year.
Yeah, that's good. It's been a good year. It's been a strange year for me. I got personally knocked off the kind of reviewing cycle I was hoping to be on, just by a lot of events, some good, some bad. But it's been a great year at ARB. You know, we don't cover as much, so I think it's even harder for us to say here's a theme, because it's really just, you know, we put things out that look interesting, we see who picks them. You know, I'm reading on my own, I'm trying to do some reviewing on my own, but I'm mostly getting a sense of the field through the reviews I'm reading and editing. And when we are highlighting things from small presses and things in translation, like that's even less likely to cohere around one thing.
Yeah, I mean, so likewise, a lot of the exposure that I get to what's going on is the reviews I'm editing. So when you edit as much as you and I both do, that naturally impacts upon your ability to write yourself, and to read too, right? At ARB, and I agree, it's been a great year at ARB. Like, so excited for that website, and I almost think, yes, because you publish less, because you're not like crazy like we are at, you're not sort of gluttons for punishment like we are at Strange Horizons.
I frequently, at the end of a Strange Horizons article that I have really enjoyed, I often pull up my little word counter widget just out of curiosity.
Yeah. Thanks. You're doing something very different, I think. You know, I've talked about how Strange Horizons is trying to sort of get a window on everything. Mm-hmm. I don't recommend that approach. Like, it's a lot. So I think ARB's kind of more kind of focused deep dives are really useful.
You know, it's something that I have been thinking a lot about. You know, I kind of never get, well, I shouldn't say I never get tired of. I should say I have, thus far, I have not gotten tired of talking about the craft of reviewing and kind of like drilling down on it. And something I've been thinking a lot about this year, you know, we've been rewriting and rethinking just some like internal like guidelines we have at ARB, and I've been thinking about my own approach and my own writing, and how I think that professional reviewing, however you want to define professional, is that part of what it is doing is that it is both going beyond a sort of, boilerplate hype, but it's also going beyond personal opinion, and it's trying to draw connections out in order to make books not just single objects that sort of float there disconnected in space. Which, and I think there's kind of a Janus-based thing there, right? Where there's a sense that each book does kind of sit alone, and there's some worth to just thinking about a book sort of on its own, because it is sort of its own object. But I think it's part of the critic's and the reviewer's job to try to draw some lines, try to make some connections. Where does this sit in the field? I mean, this is kind of I think the whole reason we do both of our reviewing and editing projects, both of our podcasts, is trying to make those connections and kind of put it somewhere a little bit, not definitively, but what does it point towards? And that I think that's maybe the thing where this is a purely vibes-based analysis. It's not empirical. It's not an airtight logical argument. But this feeling that like science fiction is in some kind of weird decline, I think is partially that I don't have a ton of highly connected rhizomatic texts that are definitely science fictional, that are pointing to like things going on. There are definitely individual science fiction books I read this year that were fantastic, but I don't feel that they're pulling a ton together for me.
Yeah, I think that might be true. And partly it's a cycle that literatures get into, right? Because if there are fewer people interested in or reading or writing a particular form, then the number of texts that can be in conversation with each other reduces. The conversation gets quieter and quieter, which just sort of feeds into a kind of, I'm not going to say doom loop, but it feeds into a lull, right? Mm-hmm. I also think, and I've written about this a couple of times in the Snap Criticism columns, I think that other traditions are sort of moving into the speculative space and saying, what we have called science fiction, or what the sort of, again, the Anglophone, the UK, US world have called science fiction for 100 years, that's not it, right? It's not all that it is. And there's all this other stuff too. And I think, critics and reviewers are trying to get their collective heads around that too. And when we do, it might be that, the rhizomatic map seems clearer again. But I think too that we've both used this word reviewer and critic like almost as a kind of compound, reviewer and critic. And the endless question of what the difference is between the two does come into play. And I think the sort of common way that this is split is along that single text versus connective sort of reflection split. So whether I agree with that or not, I don't know, but I do think that at Strange Horizons, all of our reviews are of single texts. They do tend to sort of draw those connections and, try and get beyond, as you say, just personal opinion, kind of knee-jerk, this is how I felt about this book, towards something more, I don't even want to say evidenced, but, just more embedded in a set of literatures. But then the podcast, which you mentioned, Critical Friends, which has been back this year in a kind of slightly different format for various reasons, the idea there was to do precisely what you're talking about, which was to take a couple of reviews from a given month, get them talking to each other, so stick to the two texts at first, but then move outwards beyond that and sort of, if you like, make concrete that process in a single hour's conversation, which hopefully has been working okay, because I think that some of that is like hopefully helpful and, in my view, a little bit necessary, that these texts aren't just products we're picking off a shelf, right? There's something else too. We're just trying to figure out what.
I think there's something I've been thinking about this year let's see if I can connect this thought. Specifically, you talk about other traditions coming in to this sort of speculative space, or maybe they've been there and we're sort of acknowledging that they're there, however we want to think about.
It's all of the things,
Right.
yeah.
But one thing I've been thinking about a lot is the way and I mean like the vocal reading public who like kind of talk to each other and kind of worry about what we all think in science fiction and fantasy. I think sometimes there's this feeling like we want core classic traditions to sort of be dominant in a way that we can easily see, and people get uneasy when that's not the case. And it's like, well, if they're still writing 20 good science fiction books a year, how is that different from the golden era? Were there more than 20 great science fiction books published in 1954 or whatever, or in 1967, pick your year, right? And now there's so much stuff out there that the focus tends to move towards only what's being really commercially successful, and that might not look like what you're looking for. I've been thinking a lot about, did you read that, oh shoot, I can't remember the publication now that put out the UK sales numbers for the speculative genres.
Oh, yeah.
And the Romantasy just like making not even a slice of the pie, just like a hair in the pie is like non-Romantasy. And people had some really strange reactions to that. And I'm like, this is not taking territory, right, that belongs to tradition. This is just a lot of people read romance. A lot of people are reading this new version to an extent that just when you put those numbers side by side, your old category just kind of is so small. But I'm like, that's not taking away. It's only taking away if you consider that like this space of genre needs to be commercially defined by these few couple tropes that I like more. But I've also just been thinking about what happens to the discussing communities when the thing you really like, if you really like space opera, if you really like stuff with spaceships and nuts and bolts and they go to other planets, if that is barely even a niche, right, it becomes almost like this sort of like hobbyist thing. And it's kind of funny because there might be more people writing it now than in the quote unquote golden age, right? There might be more space opera books coming out now than there were in 1985 or whatever. But it doesn't feel prominent. And so people get their back up about that. I don't know. I'm not sure what to say about that. I will say that on a purely information level, I'm looking at what's coming out. What do I want to review? What do I want to see other people reviewing? It is interesting to just see the kind of science fiction and fantasy that I'm looking for getting harder and harder to find just in the sheer number of romantasy, of LitRPG and progression fantasy, all these like really numerous, voluminous, commercially successful categories right now. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that. It's nothing against those genres, but it is having an effect on how I look and think about the field.
Yeah, I mean, so much to say. So I think...
Well, I have a question before you hold that in your thought.
Go. Well, I won't, but...
Purely out of curiosity, has Strange Horizons covered anything from Baen lately?
No. Yeah.
And neither has ARB. Neither has maybe one or two at Locus. But like I think about that, and like for listeners who don't know, Baen is a publisher who really specializes in this very classic feeling kind of often military science fiction, very classic epic kind of fantasy stuff. I don't want to get into it, but they have a somewhat, I think, unsavory reputation because of the kind of politics that many of their prominent authors and other people have sometimes endorsed. And it's so funny when people are like, "Oh, there are no space operas this year. Where's the military SF?" But like, I'm looking through the Edelweiss list, and Baen put out like 40 military science fiction books this year, but we're not talking about them. I don't know. That's just an aside. Like,
no, I no, it isn't. It's really important, and so we get the Baen catalogs in on the regular. I always look at them, so I don't just delete them. I keep going, and I'm always scanning them for titles. I sometimes even find some. And, some of this is... Magazines have readerships too.
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you are looking for reviews that you think your readership will enjoy, as well as trying to cover the literature as widely as you can. And there are balances to strike there, right? And also, some books I don't want to cover. Mm-hmm. There's some books I just don't want to give, that platform to. But then there's another level of selection where I put a couple of Baen books on the books received list, send them round. Maybe reviewers don't want to read them either, right? So it's not that, in my view, that there's a big kind of conspiracy against these kinds of books. Earlier in the year, I was talking about science fiction in translation on Blue Sky, and Cheryl Morgan sends me a public kind of reply back, essentially asking why Strange Horizons hates British science fiction. Now, I don't even know whether Cheryl knows that I'm British. Like, I don't know. I'm also not conscious. That's not to say Cheryl's wrong, but I'm not conscious of being kind of actively against British science fiction. Because the SFT that we covered in this special week we did, which was about the National Endowment of the Arts being defunded, had focused all on stuff that had been published in America. Just that one week, because that was the issue we were looking at. But nevertheless, I did go back and have a think about this, because sometimes, just almost by accident, those kinds of prejudices or whatever else get in the way. Mm-hmm. I don't think they do on the British side of things. I don't think they do on the Baen side of things. But sometimes there are so many levels for a kind of book to get through, or a commercially successful, or in Baen's case, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder how Baen sell that many MIL-SF books a year, but they clearly do. How that market is reflected in the criticism. And I think about this. I do, because... Another example, the most recent books reviewed list, and this is very inside baseball, so we can cut this too. But the most recent books reviewed list, received list that I sent out to the Strange Horizons reviewers included Richard Morgan's latest.
Yeah, right.
And at first, I didn't put it on the list. Mm-hmm. And then I thought I wanted to see what would happen. So I put it on and no one wanted it. So, but nevertheless... So I do think about this and how to kind of both, as we were saying at the beginning, capture the full vision of the field, whilst also calibrating, tastes, right? Both readership's tastes, reviewers' tastes, our tastes, and it isn't easy. I've also sort of tried to cover a bit more Romantasy this year, because I felt like it was something that not just SH but critics in general were kind of, I agree, having a strange reaction to. Because genre literature, science fiction and fantasy literature, is not the only place in our culture right now which is having strange reactions to the distribution of access within those spaces changing, is all I'll say. And we need to kind of try and fight back against that too. It's been a thing, yeah. And will continue to be, I suspect.
Yeah, and it's tricky. I don't know. I think about that a lot. I had the same thoughts about the Richard K. Morgan. Morgan is a fairly prolific and popular SF writer. He wrote the Takeshi Kovacs / Altered Carbon books, among others. And he went very vocally and publicly transphobic a little bit ago. And so a lot of SF folks are less inclined to be interested in his work, to put it mildly. I don't want to think that, I really don't want to think that there are any authors that I would, want ARB to blacklist effectively. But I also, again, we have readerships and we have, reviewers who are making their own choices about what they want to read. I don't know that there's any benefit to anyone in publishing a potentially negative review of a book that my readership wouldn't be that interested in reading anyway. Sure. I just don't know what the point of that is.
And also you can't, I was just going to say, sometimes you can't win, right? So many years ago now, I wrote a review of a book called Orbis by Neil Asher and didn't like it. And in my view, I didn't like it for aesthetic reasons, right? But his response to that was, that website has an axe to grind. So you can write a review of these books in good faith, and they'll still be reacted to in bad faith. So, what are you going to do?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think a lot about Strange Horizons and ARB and other venues as well. I think, part of what we're trying to do is pull together pretty disparate readerships, right? And try to get us in the room and have a conversation. I think in the extremely tacit, usually unwritten agreement, of what that readership is that we have certain values in common, right? So we're sort of drawing a circle around that. But I also think that, part of reviewing, and maybe leaning more on the reviewing than the criticism side, is just providing a look at the field, for people who aren't going to read those books. I think about that a lot with Romantasy. At ARB, we don't have any dedicated reviewers who are particularly interested in covering Romantasy. And I often feel like, well, maybe we're doing a little bit of a disservice to people who could be getting exposed to this more. But you need to find those writers, those reviewers and critics in the first place. I'm thinking of the wonderful job, for example, that Jenny Hamilton does at Reactor, right? Where I can't wait to read the next thing because they're books I'm by and large not reading. And I want to have an insider's take on what's working, what's interesting, what's going on in there. But when you take something that if Romantasy and LitRPG and all of these things, if we put them on equal footing with the rest of the genre, they are the genre. And then it feels kind of silly that we're not talking about them.
Yeah. So I think there are two ways of seeing it, the Romantasy thing this year. And of course, again, it's not just this year. Like, this has been a trend for some time now, as we were saying at the beginning. There are two ways of seeing it. The first is what you were kind of intimating earlier, which is that it's kind of... It's not that it's not SFF, but it is that it is primarily romance with new types of trapping. And that proceeds from all kinds of places, most obviously AO3, right? So, but nevertheless, that it's romance first, and then the other stuff second. So when we're talking about it and worrying about our genre, we kind of don't need to worry about our genre in scare quotes, because our genre is the same as it ever was. It's not selling many books, and it's kind of a niche interest, right? Except that we've now got this strange accretion trailed on top. I'm less interested in that reading in some ways. I think there's truth to it. But the other way of looking at it is that something about how speculative tropes have filtered through the culture has resulted in this kind of profusion of a particular type of speculative text. And I do think we need to grapple with that. And, for places like Strange Horizons, ARB, Locus, all these places, we have to simultaneously, if we don't have reviewers already, we have to reach out to them, but also we have to, even without them, start to look like places which would publish those kinds of review, because otherwise those kinds of reviewers aren't going to come to us. And that's a really, tricky one to do, but I think it's important that we try. I mean, I've never been like a core genre guy. The sort of comfortable verities of where I'm from, British SF fandom, particularly sort of 20, 25 years ago, really rubbed me up the wrong way, in fact. So I'm very happy with this kind of more confused setting, but I'm very conscious that there are people that aren't. Talking about like that, and the fact that we have audiences that are made of various different types of reader and so on. One book from 2025 that really strikes me as sitting on some fault lines is When There Are Wolves Again by E.J. Swift, which is a kind of science fiction. It's also a kind of lit-fic almost in presentation. It is kind of nature writing too, and it's beautiful nature writing in places, like properly moving. But the big, for Strange Horizons, the big fault line it sat on, and which has generated quite a bit of discussion, is kind of, it envisions a future where the system basically works. The systems we have right now basically struggle, but do not break in coping with climate change and all of that stuff. And then there are other books that we've covered very recently, like Metal from Heaven, that take a much more radical position. And we published a review, a very admiring review of the Swift. And I'm sure that some of our readers are like, yeah, in fact, I know because we did a podcast episode about it. We're like, yeah, but come on, this isn't a complete piece of work because it's not grappling as it should with blah, blah, blah. But then we get back to this idea of text and conversation. One text can't grapple with everything the conversation can. And hopefully, likewise with audiences. And we can bring people a bit more together. But I don't mean it in a sort of, silly way.
I think there's something, and this is also not a new question, a new concern, but I feel like this has been increasing, at least my perception of it, is this sort of tension with, we're in a polycrisis, right? We're at a point in history that, maybe in 50 years things will be different. But like right now, it feels like we are entering a critical state politically, environmentally, right? Where there's a lot of big questions, there's a lot of big concerns. People are hurting in a lot of different ways, and the genre of imagination is getting a lot put on it in a way that, I don't want to like cast out how useful science fiction and fantasy and other speculative forms are for envisioning ways of thinking about things and for, I think, just changing the basic way you look at the world. I think the ability to have that constant counterfactual that things are the way they are for a reason, and they could be different with different reasons. And to sort of start to get a feel around like, well, there are limits to what we know and how we comprehend things, and maybe keep that in mind that we're not imagining everything possible. There are things beyond our imagination that might come to be, good and bad. I think there's a lot of use there. But I think given that any book set in the future has to grapple with how did we get there? How does it look like this? How is this at all plausible? I remember that thing about, Gibson saying when people thought that the Sprawl trilogy, a Neuromancer and its sequels were nihilistic and depressing. And his response in an interview somewhere was like, what are you talking about? I think people are still there in the future. Like, to me, that seems wildly optimistic. Anything set in the future has to grapple with, well, how did we get there despite capitalism and climate change and like rising international tensions, all these things. And any book that is a fantasy, right, that is purely secondary, I think kind of gets asked, well, why is the world the way that it is? We have these constant like, scab picking, hugboxing discussions of how are you imagining a fruitful way of getting around today's problems, or are you highlighting them in interesting ways? And there's this sort of like increasing pressure for this one particular kind of literature to have answers and to tell us what to do. And that doesn't make for great literature, and it's rare that a book can do that.
Yeah, and I think, so, some science fiction has always been so engaged. H.G. Wells, very interested in this kind of thing, right? Some science fiction hasn't. And we're not looking to, you're right, we don't look to crime fiction to solve our problems for us. And if we start to judge all science fiction and fantasy on how is it telling us what to do, then we are very much limiting what that literature canon should be doing, and B, creating a rod for our own backs as readers, where we experience a book along only one vector. On the other hand, I think one of the things that has happened to science fiction, and this is over the last 10 years too, it's not just in 2025, although there have been some notable examples, is that because of its apparent utility in that way to understand society, the social novel, the literary social novel, has adopted a lot of SF tropes. There has been cross-pollination here. So some science fiction, and I think of something like Sylvia Parks' Luminous this year, reads a lot like litfic. It's obviously very much science fiction, but it kind of presents in a different way. And then something like a book that you told me to read ahead of this, you told me to read it ahead of this episode, See Now, by Eva Meyer, is a Dutch piece of litfic, which is very obviously kind of speculative. I don't know whether it's science fiction or maybe it's not quite granular enough for that. It's more a kind of speculative parable or something. But nevertheless, you get that happening on both sides. And that's one of the most interesting things that's been happening to science fiction for the last few years, I think. And you've been seeing it in Booker Prize shortlists and Booker Prize winners, actually, which you would not have done 20 years ago. So this apparent need for science fiction to teach us stuff is both an interesting thing which has had, really good sort of artistic outgrowths, and also something that sometimes troubles me. And with reviews likewise, with criticism likewise. Does every piece of criticism need to be about the politics of a given book? I'd hope not, but then also in this moment feels kind of urgent. There's no answer to that.
And this is like too big a statement and too big a, I don't even want to call it a complaint, but we're in this era where most mass culture is having that kind of scrutiny, right? Like we try to keep my focus is very much on books and the written word, but when a new season of television drops, right, you get 1,000 think pieces about it, and none of them are about the script choices or the blocking or the lighting or the camera or even like the plot for the most part, right? Like beyond sort of like summarizing it. They're about sort of like, what does it mean? What does it tell us? Oh, who wrote that? Oh, this is from a while back now. There's maybe a McSweeney's piece. One of my favorite essays. I'll have to look it up and put it in the notes. Maybe I'll awkwardly interject it right here. Prestige TV in the Time of Climate Fiction by Sarah Miller for The New Yorker in 2014, which was about watching the golden age of television in the midst of the climate apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this person like getting into discussions about, the Sopranos and Breaking Bad as their apartment is flooding, like this kind of feeling that we're in. Where was I going with that thought? Well, just this idea that like there's a lot going on in the world. We don't have a ton of super organized political or cultural or even religious movements that are giving us a lot of clear direction. And so I think there's this desire to like, well, let's turn to art and try to pull something out of it, which I don't know that that's always bad as an instinct, but it's leading to some weird places in how our general reception of these things look.
I think so, yeah. And so I think I'm going to write about this book in the next Snap column, which is The Book of Records by Madeleine Tien. And this is a really interesting meditation, this book, on some of these questions. So it's set in a kind of climate ravaged future, although you get the sense that some parts of the world are sort of still going. But the large swaths of the book are historical fiction. So the protagonist in the future is reading some books that they've saved from the rising waters, and they're biographies of thinkers, so Hannah Arendt and others. And the novel just sort of goes through these. One of the others is Spinoza, so 17th century, 20th century, and then whatever date this is in the future, and just draws parallels and says, in a not complacent way, it's looked bad before. It's looked pretty bad before. Mm-hmm. And I found that quite a helpful way of employing science fiction in a way which didn't just instrumentalize it, which was really interesting to watch, but it's not a trick that everyone can play. It's just this one book can do it. And that brings us back to the text versus the conversation, right?
There's a thing I've been thinking about a lot so there's the perpetual low-key freak out about cozy and comfort, sending their plushy tentacles into other genres.
But this is the other reaction to what we're talking about, right?
Yeah. Well, one thing I have been specifically thinking about that just lately is a lot of this like peak golden age science fiction, which I'm not going to define super closely here, but we'll say somewhere in the 50s and 60s, let's say, that was all coming from a place of comfort and privilege, right? That was coming from this incredible spike in living standards, and people, more able to, not say that like everything was better in the past, but like when you're writing about nuclear war from your comfortable apartment that you can pay for, at a very markedly different percentage of your income compared to today, you're sort of writing from that position already. And maybe there's something going on today with us feeling like we're all in the thick of it a little more and it's changing the rules.
Yeah, I think so, 100%. I mean, what I was talking about the kind of certainties, the generic certainties that have kind of broken down over the last 10, 15 years, they were comforts. They were very comfortable spaces, whatever the texts were actually talking about, which obviously in some cases were pretty grim fare. They were talking about them within a context of significant comfort.
I think about those like Wyndham disasters, right?
Exactly. I mean, the classic example.
They're very fun to read, but like no one's really worried about what they're going to eat. You don't really get that feeling that I'm actually like concerned about, am I going to have enough food tomorrow?
Even Ballard, right? Now, I got a lot of time for Ballard, but even Ballard, it's a patrician kind of catastrophe, right?
Yeah.
It's a very particular form of. It's not even dystopia, right? But this the disintegrations that, or the decoalescences that Ballard produces, they're still from Ballard, who was a fundamentally, very comfortable patrician kind of guy. And then I think about the current trends for dystopia, which are significant and, almost dominant. And this year I read a book called The Unworthy by Agustina Basterrecka, who's an Argentinian writer. It's in translation, of course, because I'm an awful monoglot. But it is grim. It is a form of horror, this dystopia. It is quite difficult to read at places. It's very slim. Some people have said that it's a little bit too similar to Handmaid's Tale in that it focuses on a community in a kind of seemingly kind of almost nuclear irradiated future. A small community of women who are presided over by a man and a very thin layer of kind of willing helpmeet women who sort of perpetuate the very, very violent and sadistic oppression. But I think that it is very knowingly playing with all of these tropes and turning them up to 11 because of the distress that Basterrecka sort of either feels or intuits our culture is feeling. And it was a really striking book. Really, I found quite sort of, as I say, difficult to read in a good way, if there is such a thing. And those dystopias now, I think, are they are so much pointier than the kind of the Wyndham stuff. And there's no doubt that that's because of the context in which they are being written right now in 2025. Yeah.
This is not at all original thought, but I have been a stance that I have been finding helpful in thinking about books this year is specifically thinking about them as performance and thinking about them as speech act. I started thinking about this a lot actually at Worldcon this year with the poetry Hugo, which, modern poetry is not something I keep up on that much. I don't have a lot of strong opinions about it either way. But one thing that really struck me was going to a couple readings and hearing people read their stuff was how much that performative element is built into it. That to a certain extent, you're intending this is something I'm going to read to people. And think about, books are that too. Books are speech acts, they're performance. And so thinking about Ballard, if you frame it as, here's this guy from this situation and this background, but here's the thought he kind of wants to share with the room. I think that's a nice way to read that. And we're kind of in different rooms right now. And that makes me think about a sort of a different angle. And it gives me a little more, I don't know, I guess maybe a little more patience with things like cozy and comforting genre, subgenres that otherwise I might not have much patience with. But if I kind of step back a little bit and ask why are they seeking this tone and this effect right now, doesn't always, to me, justify it. And I think sometimes I don't want to pile on Becky Chambers, but I think one of the more interesting critical approaches to her is thinking about why this comforting stance on these politics is what's being put forward. It's a fruitful one to think about. But yeah, you have a thought, yeah.
Yeah, I do. Well, it's not my thought, unfortunately. It's the thought of a much better critic, Paul Kincaid, whose book Colourfields came out this year.
Yes.
And I recommend to all. But Paul Kincaid, in response to a conversation that we had over on Critical Friends about Becky Chambers, pointed out that he doesn't find the Chambers stuff cozy at all because it's completely unbelievable. There are no stakes. It is that the game is totally tilted in favor of, just making everyone be nice to the nice things. Doesn't find it cozy. Because it's not, in a way, reassuring. Because if the only way to make things nice is to tilt the game so totally, if anything close to what is our actual experience can't in any way be nice, it's the Chambers books are the opposite of that. And indeed, in later volumes prove that, because, they get into really weird kind of eugenicist spaces, almost, as a result of the kind of corners they've painted themselves into. So, yeah, I tried likewise to be open to cozy because I see it as the other side of this sort of coin, and it's the same thing. effectively. But yeah, of course, there are good cozy texts and bad cozy texts in exactly the same way as there are good, really grim, horrific dystopias, and there are pretty bad ones too.
I think a lot about how utopia is a star that has fallen pretty far. You don't see a lot of like consciously organized utopias presented that way. And for me, part of what's really interesting about a good utopia is there a road there or not? Can you imagine how to get there or not? And I think both kinds can be really interesting. I'm thinking of Killjoy's Country of Ghosts. Do you happen to know that?
No.
Which that might be one of the last like straight up definitely utopia I've read in a while. Which is a very short. It's very thought experimenty. It's a very like I think pretty intentionally in this maybe even kind of like 19th century style of like let me walk you around it, and explain how it works.
Yeah.
Offering a utopia as opposed to a dystopia, you can either find a way there. You can think about, well, how could I get my society there in a way that's really interesting, or you can't, and that has its own kind of grim underside. But I want to pause because we've been going really good here. Let's take a quick break. We can come back. We can talk a little more about utopia and dystopia if we want. And I want to talk about some highlights of reads that we had this year, just to share with people. All right, we are back. One of the things that Dan and I have agreed on, and I've heard other critics say versions of this year, is it is a year strangely lacking in tentpole books, strangely lacking in big, obvious, everyone rally around it. This will definitely clearly be the front runner for multiple awards next year kind of books. Still a lot of good stuff. So minus tentpoles, we are going to crawl along under the canvas together and talk about what is still inside this. Does that metaphor work? You track that? You follow that?
Yeah, we'll go with it. We'll run.
Okay. This is why I'm a critic. So, Dan, highlights for you this year. If there were patterns, call out those patterns. If there were no patterns, let us call out those individual books. What'd you like that was published this year in 2025?
Yeah, so we've talked about what patterns there have been, I think, and whatever patterns there have been related to these ideas of, sort of the political slant of a lot of stuff, the kind of, let's use the positive, the polyvocal thing, rather than talking about the fragmentation. I think it's much better to talk about polyvocalism. So my favorites, I've listed a few already just in terms of conversation. There's one worth talking about, which is The Expansion Project by Ben Pester, which was shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize, which is a sort of prize in the UK which came about because people thought the Booker was too middlebrow. So it's for experimental fiction, right? It's great. It's a kind of satire, so a little bit like See Now, which we mentioned earlier. I don't know whether I'd call it science fiction, although it ends in this kind of very kind of almost matrixy pod, very, very high up in a impossible architecture thing. But it's fundamentally an amusing satire of the workplace. It reminded me a little bit of The Employees from a couple of years ago, in that it's a fragmented narrative of a workplace. In this case, it's not a spaceship. It's at first a normal-looking business park somewhere boring in Britain. But what we realize, and the title of the book suggests it too, is that this business park is weirdly expanding. So it's kind of starting to take over all of the lands around it in a very Area X kind of way. So from the Vandermeer books. And it's funny, and it's scary in places, and just very well written. It was an interesting read. It's pretty slim as well, so I'd recommend that, because I think that's one that hasn't been on sort of SF critics' radars as much, but I think it should be. It reminded me a lot of Ned Bowman, who I know you covered recently on the pod. So, yeah, that's one of mine. What about one of yours?
Yeah, well, I just want to say, too, I'm going to have to look for that again. I must have mistyped the name. I couldn't even get a Google hit for the expansion project, so I'm going to look around more because I want to pick that up. Yeah, for me this year, a couple, positive patterns just in my own personal reading. First off, paying a lot more attention to work and translation, which a lot of places have done. I think a lot of reviewing magazines and award bodies are paying more attention, which is great. I believe the British Science Fiction has added a short translated. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. And I think we'll see some more in the coming year here. Folks probably know from me talking in the past, I'm part of a group trying to suggest one for the translated Hugo. I won't talk about that at length. It's been informative and fun to work on. We're going to keep working on that. What will become of it, I don't know. But yes, See Now, probably my number one most recommended book this year, I think. Which, it only came out in October. I read it a couple months before that. But, probably the book I'm most recommending to people because it is such a tight little book. It's so funny and sad and poignant. It's a really clever mix. Great job, Ann Thompson-Mello, on the translation, too. Obviously, I haven't read the original, but to have a book that was that lively and was doing that much wordplay and that much tonal shifting, I really, really dug. The other one that I really liked in translation this year was Dengue Boy by Mitchell Nieve, which is a really fun, berserk, bonkers.
It is wild, isn't it?
Yep. Gore splattered, many exclamation marks scattered through the book, but just a ton of fun. I think that was something I prized a lot in books this year, was books that were fun in a way that didn't grate on me. And then have to mention Notes from a Regicide by Isaac Fellman.
Of course, we should. Yeah.
Which I am a Fellman stan. I'm in the tank, but I am so worried that this book, once again, is not going to quite find its audience. It's really interesting, I think, that it is speculative fiction, and it is speculative fiction, but you can so easily imagine tilting it just a little bit and not being. Go ahead. Yeah, you have thoughts on this too.
100%. So, first of all, on it being kind of potentially lost, I agree that would be a real shame. Now, the last book that I worried in print about being lost was Rake's Fall. Because I was worried it would get lost in the kind of the wake of Sated Bright Doors. So I am going to say now, right, that I am worried that Notes from a Regicide is going to get lost, right? I am worried, guys. And then hopefully that will have the same effect, and we'll be here 12 months from now and it will have won the Le Guin, right?
Right.
So, but on that idea of it being a kind of really fragile kind of generic position, I agree. And I'm glad you said it, because I was wondering whether this was just me, and it probably still is. But it reminded me of Chris Priest so much in places. Like, there was just this Priestian crystalline element to it where it was always slightly out of reach, brilliantly, tantalizingly, and yet you never had a doubt about what was happening, and you really cared about what was happening. The worlds were, you got the sense of being completely thought through, but it didn't share that with you. I thought it was great. Really, really good book. And one of those books that operates on an aesthetic level, like a very kind of considered aesthetic level too. Yeah, great book.
Reading it made me think a lot, again, because of this, there are these very, I don't want to say minor, but the speculative elements are not in your face, right? It is far in the future, right? Like, clearly climate change has happened, right? Like, big things have happened. There is one city that has some particularly fantastic speculative elements to it. I was thinking about the way that the narrators, there are really two narrators, they both find it very normal in a way that I think is really hard to pull off while still, and that's that very Priestian sort of thing where oftentimes you have a character in Priest who is not reacting to things the way you think they should be reacting, and it's because they have a whole different concept of what's going on. But yeah, that was really good. What else? That was one of mine. What else is on your list?
I'd like to talk about short fiction a little bit.
Yes, please.
So one of the trends I'm a novel guy. To my detriment, I'm very happy to say this is one of the holes in my reading. I do if I'm looking for a book, I do habitually turn to novels. But partly at your suggestion, but also just generally, I've read quite a bit of short fiction this year, and I would really like to sort of bring out Debbie Urbansky's Portal Mania as one that we really should be kind of putting a pin in as a keeper. Every story in that is great, and again, there's this kind of, I mean, maybe this is just you and I now. This is what we prefer. Again, there's this like really kind of tightrope walk of a generic position where, so for example, there's one story in the collection where lots of people, lots of women all over the world start to quote unquote change, and they start changing into different creatures. These creatures get given different names based on their various categories and characteristics. But on the other hand, it's just a story about what happens when a wife starts refusing to have sex with her husband, and it's brilliant. And this awful entitled husband character starts to watch political debates with this kind of Trump-like person that's standing for a governor, and it's just very sort of gentle. I've made it sound like it's very sort of pointed satire, and it's really not. It's a very sort of complete character study, and the transformations in it are very sort of sensitively handled, but also, as I say, kept at some distance in a similar way to the Fallman. And every story does that. The first story in the book is just some people driving around in a white van, and people think there's a portal in the van. Right? No one ever goes through the portal. We never see the portal. It's just a van driving around a town. And it's just very clever and involving. And I love short stories that when you finish them very quickly, feel like you've been reading them forever.
Yeah.
And Urbansky really, really achieves that in this volume. It's great.
I am like you in that I am an inveterate novel reader, somewhat to my shame. Part of it is that I need an object.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on my computer or my phone all day. When I want to read, I need to like have the thing in a dead tree format, and I need to go sit down and read it. And I think the other thing too is that as a reviewer mostly of novels, I sort of take on like, yes, I'm going to read a fair number of books I don't like or do not finish. That is my cross to bear with novels, and I'm unwilling to pick it up for another format. So I don't want to be trawling through. I don't want to be mudlarking for short stories. I want the best to be given to me. So which is why I love a collection. It's why I love an anthology. It's why I keep hoping that we will see a commercial resurgence of anthologies, because I think they're just such a great way to get a sense of what's going on out there. There's a lot of wonderful short fiction being published. There's so many tiny little magazines struggling by and putting out some cool stuff. But the problem is there's a lot of stuff out there that I don't want to read as well. And so I need someone to go through and give that to me.
But we might be part of the problem here, because although we're sort of talking about how great these short fiction collections are, so Uncertain Suns, Thomas Hare's, great. I mean, so great. I mean, I would...
Offensively great.
Yeah. I mean, it should be stopped.
Yep.
It should be stopped. And I would associate it with... It's not similar to this book, but in terms of its impact and the clarity of it and the way in which it is sort of completely itself, but also extremely sort of broad. I'd just say, I mean, it's like Ted Chiang's Stories of Your Life and Others, like right. in terms of its level of craft, and that's very high praise from me. I thought that book at the time was great, but magazines are really struggling. They are closing all of the time, and writers like Thomas Hare and Urbansky, that's where they publish these short stories that then we very comfortably go to the collections to read.
Right.
So how you square that, I don't know, because there's clearly some great short fiction work happening, like really, really good. And yet the magazines that form the basis of that ecosystem don't seem to be doing as well.
Right. I don't have a great solution to that.
Sign up.
Sign up for one or two magazines, people. It's not that much money. I try to keep one going a year. But these weren't the only collections I read this year. I read Lena Krau's Sinkhole and Other Inexplicable Voids. Fantastic collection. Again, that tightrope, that blending together. There are stories here that are clearly climate fiction. There are stories here that are clearly science fiction or magical realism. I was thinking a lot through... Another one I'll throw in the mix is Ed Park's An Oral History of Atlantis, which Go ahead.
He cheats though,
Yeah.
because he starts his collection with a story about science fiction reviewers. So like he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, hooked us. That collection was so good. I was thinking about, through a bunch of these collections as I was reading them, thinking about, the way that the genre rules play out a little differently in the short format. And there's a flexibility and sort of a different and larger tradition of using irrealist short fiction to address really interesting things. I was thinking about the way that there's an extent to which it's almost an accident that we count people like Kelly Link, right? You know what I mean? Right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
An obvious master of the form, and with slightly different acceptances, right, would just be straight up litfic, right? I mean, I imagine that most genre fans would not consider George Saunders or T.C. Boyle in the genre, and like, does Ajay Brenya fall on that side of the line or not? Does Owen Cotman fall on the side of the line or not? It kind of depends how you think about it, because these hard and fast rules about what makes science fiction, what makes fantasy really only works in a certain kind of, 250 to 600 page thing. And below that, you can bend the rules so much.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that is where the hope is. So we've been talking a little bit. I feel like we came to a series of impasses earlier in our conversations. Like, how do you, these works that are set in other worlds or other futures, how do you get there? How do you cross from our experience right now to that? And in that gulf, does the reader kind of just sort of fall down? So on and so forth. And we didn't really have an answer for it. I would like to say that it just feels to me, and I'm thinking of a collection like Deep Dream, Indra Daz's collection this year. Mm-hmm. It just feels to me like in short fiction, perhaps especially, but also in books, increasingly, in novels, increasingly it feels to me, there just might be a bubbling, a stirring of something else, like something that can bridge us. And the literature has just been stuck for a while now in many places about, how to do that, how to imagine itself somewhere else, how to imagine ourselves somewhere else. And I kind of feel like the 2025, just tiny sort of specks of light coming through. That may come to nothing. As I said right at the beginning of this conversation, you can't really say in a given year whether anything is really happening. Might come to nothing, because last year I thought space opera was coming back. So don't listen to me. But I just had that sense, and I'd like to think that it's based in something other than, silly optimism.
I'm looking down my list. Did I read any space opera this year? I don't know if I did. I'm always game, but yeah.
I was completely wrong. Like, I thought it was coming back, and it just did not. I think I was really influenced by one of the last books I read last year, which was Countess by Suzanne Palumbo, which was super. I really enjoyed it. And I thought, oh yeah, we're going to get more of this because it's great. And not so much.
It's also funny how, books take a while to write and edit and publish and get out there. And we're all on these sort of lines, which also to me makes the trends that much more interesting, that people were separately thinking about this stuff. Science fiction has been talking about AI for a really long time. And the sort of like weird, like panicky hype bubble we're in right now of AI and culture has really been only going on for maybe, 18 months, 2 years. So it's very funny to have like multiple interesting, good award-winning books about AI that were presumably written before that writing was on the wall.
Yeah, a good example of that, and maybe this is the last one I'll mention, was this year's Clark winner, Anibot. Which I think just rode a zeitgeist that maybe it wasn't even aware it was going to ride when it first started to stir in the author's mind. But it was a really interesting example again of kind of a smooshing of different genres together, and a lot of science fiction readers didn't get along with it at all for that reason. But actually I think as a kind of literary parable thing, it had some craft, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, I will say I'm hoping that we see more of that effective smooshing. I'm thinking of The Ministry of Time, right, from last year, which I think was a very effective smooshing.
Can we keep that? Can we make that a term? Can we make that a thing? Effective smooshing.
We just got to say it with a very just serious face.
That's right.
We mean it.
I'm bad at that.
We mean it as much as any other critical theory. The one I would call up too, because I don't know if it got quite as much attention, certainly not as Antibot, but is Erica Swyler's We Lived on the Horizon, which I thought was a very fun, interesting, it's a post-apocalypse kind of novel. It's sort of a post-climate novel, but it's very much about AI, but specifically it's about embodiment and thinking about what it means to be in the world in a way that I just thought very, very useful and very, very far away from the kind of disembodied, very hypey kind of discussion. I mean, jumping back to Ted Chiang, right? That's what I like so much about Chiang's work, artificial intelligence, is he's thinking about how is it going to play out? How is it going to affect people? What's it going to actually look like on the screen? And that's something that I think one of the things that Speculative, all the big giant bag of tropes that we have and the history we have of it, is allowing us to concretize those ideas, right? Maybe even to the extent of something like, we were talking about Feldman's book, right? Where like we can make all of this stuff about climate change so embedded that it's barely visible in the text in a way that's really interesting. But any last call-outs you want to make sure we mention from this year? There've been other great books we haven't talked about.
Of course, always.
Adrian Tchaikovsky and Premi Mohammed both had 27 novels out this year. There's been a lot of good stuff.
The one we haven't mentioned, I guess, that was interesting was Metallic Realms, which again is this kind of, the Lincoln Shell thing, which again sits on these series of fault lines that seem to be sort of cracking open in the genre. But if I'm honest with you, I thought you mentioned Ed Park. I thought Ed Park did what Metallic Realms was trying to do, but better. But yeah, that will be it.
The An Oral History of Atlantis is just so good, and it gives me an excuse to tell people to go back and read Same Bed, Different Dreams, which, again, is one of those novels I feel like did not get picked up on at all within genre. I think it did find its readership, maybe more like the New Yorker crowd, less the science fiction crowd.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, we reviewed it at SH, and I thought it was going to sort of be sort of bigger than it turned out to be. But yeah, that's sometimes how it is, right?
Yeah, well, and that goes back to, when we were earlier in our conversation, we were talking about, these reading publics and these different groups. And that's one of the things, I think a lot, I was thinking about that a lot with the Hugos this year and just being in Seattle for Worldcon, and the way that even among the people who have self-selected to go to Worldcon, right, which is like a couple thousand people, right, out of this much larger group of people that read that, even among that self-selected group, it's really like 8 or 9 different groups sort of superpositioned. I was on a couple panels where we were talking, there are a couple other critics. We were talking about stuff we read this year and talking about like the Hugo list and things we wish had been on it. And it was astonishing to have like this packed room full of engaged readers and just see all of these Venn diagrams not overlapping. And they're like, yeah, I did read 100 books last year, but I didn't hear about this book that these 3 critics really like,
Yeah, and this is exactly why any attempt to encompass a year in a single conversation or to pretend in any way that it has coherence or, anything approaching themes that you can identify and say that's the year is so pointless. So thanks for listening, everyone.
Everyone, thank you so much. Come back next year for more incredibly summarized recountings of the year. Dan, thanks so much for coming on. It's been great to have you back on again. Doing this podcast, I'm very carefully, avoiding banter and frequent guests. So this is a peril I know I have having you on here. But anything that folks should look out from you and your projects in the coming year?
Yeah, well, I guess that this is going out like early Jan or something.
It's going to go out like next week.
Oh, wow. Okay, wow. So in that case, I will say keep your eye on Strange Horizons in the first week of January. We always do it. So the first week is handed over entirely to our reviewers who tell you what they've read in the last 12 months. And I always am, again, amazed by the breadth of it and horrified by how few of the books they've read we've actually covered in the magazine. So go and have a look at that. It'll be good.
Dan, thanks so much for joining. Really good to see you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Casella.
A Meal at Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Barchahari, translated by John Brough. Our music is by Giselle Gabrielle Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. Thanks to our human transcribers, Kate Dollarhyde and John W.M. Thompson. They are diligently working on getting us caught up on our transcriptions. If you'd like to support the podcast and the ancillary review of books, that is rad. A few different ways you can do that. Join our Patreon. A couple dollars a month really moves us towards our sustainability and contributor paying goals. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a couple other goodies in the works. If you're interested in a book we mentioned, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut, and it helps us immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving us a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com, and you can follow us on Blue Sky for periodic skeets, I guess. Did that term stick? Okay, 2025. Farewell and or good riddance. Listeners, thanks again for tuning in this year, and folks who've chimed in on social media or email or Discord, I really appreciate the support. It's been fun. Coming up, we're going back to books. Marissa Mercurio is first up in January, talking about Richard Marsh's novel The Beetle. After that, we've got John Tatry coming on to talk about Charles Saunders' Immoral, and Eden Coopermint's returning for an episode on Egan's Diaspora. We've got more good reads on the way. Check the website if you'd like to read ahead. I hope your new year starts off well, and as always, stay critical out there.
I got talking to him to such an extent. Oh, what varieties do you have on? Oh, what do you do? Oh, how do you do this? Do you use a flat bottomed or a conical one? Oh, what do you... That I forgot to pay him. And he forgot...
You paid him, Dan.
That's right. That's what I feel. That's how I feel. He had such a nice time.